Guys, I think the influencers may be lying to us because they're all saying that the central bank digital currencies are right around the corner and that we're about to lose our freedom and privacy because of them. But is that really true though? Well, as I started digging deeper into this crazy dystopian nightmare, I started to find some inconsistencies. You see, there are many different central banks around the world, and each of them has their own plan when it comes to CBDCs. So we can't just make one blanket statement about all of them, right? We gotta look at each one individually. So that's exactly what I wanna do in this video. We're gonna go around the world to 8 different countries and see which ones have CBDCs that we should actually worry about. Starting with the first one, my home country, the United States of America. This was actually the one that made me skeptical of the influencers' claims in the first place. Because last November, the US Central Bank, aka the Fed, announced a project to test out one particular CBDC implementation. But here's the thing. The general public in the US is not on board with CBDCs. A Cato Institute survey showed that only 16% of Americans supported CBDCs, whereas over twice as many opposed them. Heck, I don't know a single person who actually wants CBDCs. So that 16% must be like Jerome Powell's friends and family or something like that. Anyways, the two main concerns from Americans are that CBDCs increase government control and reduce financial privacy. I also share those concerns, and it seems like some politicians do too. For example, Senator Ted Cruz said that CBDCs would give the Fed too much control and allow them to look into people's private spending habits. And Ron DeSantis, governor of Florida, recently signed a bill banning CBDCs in his state. So yeah, there's a lot of pushback from across the board, and if I were to bet, I'd bet that CBDCs will never happen in the USA and that the influencers were misleading us. But while that's true for the US, it may not be true for all the other countries exploring CBDCs. That's why we gotta head on over to Europe and see what's going on over there. Well, it turns out the European Central Bank is already deeply involved with CBDCs. In July of 2021, the ECB began a 2-year investigation to figure out how to best launch a digital euro. It looks like they were pleased with the results though, because they announced that they were proceeding with phase 2, where they'll develop the technical details and business agreements needed to launch a digital euro. But what do all the EU citizens think about this? Well, it seems like they're fine with a CBDC as long as it lets them keep some financial privacy. So they're more focused on coming up with an acceptable design rather than being completely against the digital euro. Unfortunately, the cynic in me thinks that their government will never give them the privacy that they desire. And that means, at least for the EU, it seems like the influencers were right, that it really is time to panic for all the CBDC hating Europeans out there. But for this next country, panicking won't do you any good because their CBDC is already live, and that'd be China, with their digital yuan launched way back in 2020. But here's what's interesting about that. Their CBDC adoption is pitiful. Their digital yuan only makes up about 0.13% of their central bank's cash and reserves. And that gets even more puzzling when you consider that several hundred million digital wallets have been created already, and they've collectively pulled in over 10 billion in volume. So what could explain that discrepancy? Well, analysts believe that adoption is pitiful because there's really no good incentive to switch over. To use the digital yuan, you gotta download an app, sign up, and transfer your money over. So it's really quite a hassle. Not to mention, the Chinese consumer already has really easy to use payment apps in Alipay and WeChat Pay. So even with the discounts and the giveaways that the Chinese central bank is doing, the average consumer is still not interested in switching. So yeah, I think the digital yuan is never gonna get much traction unless the Chinese government forces people to use it. But that's of course definitely a possibility because they don't seem like they're gonna give up on their CBDC that easily. Now, this next country desperately wants their CBDC to be ready because their currency and economy is getting squeezed by sanctions. Yep, you guessed it, that'd be Russia. And the digital ruble is already being beta tested as of April of this year. Their whole CBDC timeline was expedited because they're looking for an alternative to the Western-controlled SWIFT system ASAP. and they hope to launch the whole thing as early as 2024. The biggest banks in Russia are already participating in testing, so it looks like they're well on their way to hit their timeline. But the ultimate challenge here is for them to get other countries to use their CBDC, right? Because that's the only way they can lessen the impact of the sanctions. And that is definitely easier said than done. Also, another problem here is that Russian commercial banks stand to lose up to $715 million every year when the digital ruble arrives, because those are the fees that they normally get from processing payments, and those would disappear. So yeah, while I do expect to see a CBDC in Russia, I have my doubts that they'll get much adoption from both inside and outside their country because of all the hurdles I listed. Now, this next country's central bank has been trying to ban crypto for years now, so surely they don't want a CBDC, right? Well, not so fast, because that country is India, and while their central bank hates decentralized crypto coins, they have no issues with the government-controlled ones. That's why they already have a pilot program for their very own CBDC. Last year, they began rolling out both wholesale and retail versions of the digital rupee, and it's currently being distributed through a few commercial banks. While we don't know when it'll be fully rolled out, we do know that India's central bank is already looking to scale their CBDC and support offline transactions. So if you're an Indian and you hate CBDCs, then it may be time to panic. Now, the next country is a small Caribbean island that's infamously tied to FTX. Yep, that'd be the Bahamas. And they were actually the first country to fully launch a CBDC. They even gave it a special name, aka the Sand Dollar. It first became available to their citizens in October of 2020, and it represents a digital version of the Bahamian dollar. It's already integrated with most banks in their country, and their central bank is pushing hard for more people to use it. But even though the CBDC is available and integrated, it still doesn't have much adoption. The Sand Dollar accounts for less than 0.1% of the money in the Bahamas, which is surprising because almost 20% of their citizens are unbanked, and this CBDC was supposed to help them out. But I guess the people don't have much incentive to adopt it, kind of like how it is in China. So yeah, I think the Sand Dollar will continue to struggle for the foreseeable future, and it may even die off in a few years. Now, the Bahamas isn't the only place struggling with their CBDC adoption. Our next country, Nigeria, is also the same. They launched their CBDC, the e-Naira, in October of 2021. And since then, over 1 million users have been onboarded, doing over $20 to $30 million in volume. But considering that Nigeria has over 200 million people, those are pitiful adoption numbers. And that's actually not too surprising given that most Nigerians hate CBDCs. In fact, they hate it so much that they've taken to the streets to protest a fully cashless society being shoved down their throats. The Nigerian government even tried offering discounts to people using the e-Naira and allowed people without a bank account to get it. But even then, Nigerians still preferred cold hard cash. Another big hurdle here is that it does require a smartphone with an internet connection to use, so that excludes a majority of their country's citizens from using the e-Naira. So yeah, all things considered, I don't think their CBDC is anything to worry about, and if it ultimately fails, huge props goes to the Nigerian people who protested against it, so shout out to them. Now, this next country, I'm also bearish on their CBDC, but for a totally different reason, and that be South Korea. They began a 2-year program in 2020 to research the legal and technical aspects of a CBDC. And since then, their central bank has made really good progress, with several major banks taking part in their program. Plus, a partnership with Samsung to spare, a CBDC in South Korea does not make much sense. They are one of the world's most technologically advanced countries when it comes to banking after all, with over 95% of its citizens having bank accounts. So even though a CBDC might improve transaction speeds and costs a little, it would work pretty much same as their current system. And that's why I bet that their CBDC ultimately does not get a lot of adoption, because there's just no need. But yeah, after traveling to those 8 countries and checking out their CBDCs, I think you'll agree with me that we were misled when it comes to the imminent threat of CBDCs. I mean, yes, they suck and no one really wants them. But for a lot of these countries, they're more likely to fail than to take over the world as the dystopian financial virus that we were all scared of.